Welcome. So, first of all, if you could just introduce yourselves briefly and exactly what it is you do, that would be great to set the scene. Zahra, let's start with you.
Okay. Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, great. So I'm Lara, Shah, I'm representing UKAI Women in AI Working Group. I chair that group. By profession, I'm a responsible AI and frontier technology expert, and at present I serve across several boards in the public, private, and third sector. I've been an entrepreneur. I set up a AI-powered RegTech venture, and I also work with the Commonwealth.
Great, thank you very much. And Polly?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here today and inviting me to join the panel. My name is Milne. I'm CEO of a company called Future Plus. We work with businesses to help them understand their impact, track that impact over time, and then improve that impact, ideally. So we're coming from a standpoint very much of sustainability and ESG. We're not focused specifically on AI, but as you can imagine, we're seeing the subject of AI creeping in more and more into that work. And so we are learning and collaborating and forming partnerships all the time to try and understand how we can help businesses understand the impact of AI that they're using, that they're developing, track that impact over time, and hopefully make improvements.
We shall come back to that shortly. Matt, an intro to you, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Matt. So I helped create an institution over in the US called the Forum for Real World AI Measurement and Evaluation, based out of Virginia State University, and is really all focused on real world impacts and how you build towards standards of how to measure concepts such as over-reliance and alignment depth, and how you work through the real workflows. And it's really all about context. It's how do you understand context and how do you measure AI impact based in that context. Separately, I'm also the CEO of Intellect Frontier, which is essentially a commercialized branch of that, helping businesses understand real world AI impact and explicitly measuring it. And also I am the Responsible AI Working Group Chair for UKAI.
Brilliant. Well, three very different stories here. And so, what does ethical AI mean to each of you? For you, Zahra, is diversity central to it? How do you see ethical AI?
So for me, actually, it is all tied together. So for me, you cannot have ethical AI if it's not equitable. If it's not equitable, it's just lip service. And if it's not environmentally safe, then there's no future to be ethical or responsible about, really. So I feel all of the three are tied together. So for me, ethical AI comes under responsible AI, and in very simple words for people who are non-technical here, it is using AI to benefit humanity, to benefit people, and it is not using AI to harm people. That's the way I look at it.
It can be challenging to maintain the ethics because AI is very expensive to build. And I think this is a little bit the story with Anthropic and OpenAI. If you go to the big companies there, Anthropic born out of the idea of safety, but it turns out AI is really expensive to build. And so you actually end up having to do a lot of things to raise the right amount of money and in the long term be able to make the right amount of money. And so how do you think companies can balance that, maintaining their ethics and what really matters and needs to be important to all of us in the AI environment?
Again, I take a very long-term view. For me, if you're building something which you've not really followed ethics by design or responsible AI principles, in the long term, it's not going to be profitable for you because people are not going to trust you. And for business to be successful for the long term, people have to trust it. They have to trust that, if I use a product from OpenAI, ChatGPT, a lot of people do not trust ChatGPT. So you might get customers in the short term if you have a short-term mentality, but you won't keep those people in the long term.
And how about for you? How do you see ethics as being central to everything that we're doing in AI, and how do we get it right? It's a big question. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to answer in one sentence how to get it right. So how do you think we can start taking the right steps towards getting it right?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I would approach this in the same way that we would with all the sustainability challenges that we look at. So if you are thinking about ethics in any context for us, the way we work at Future Plus is to look really broadly. So we would look at climate impact, so what are the emissions of what we're building. We look at environmental impact separately. So that's water use, obviously, is a massive one, and the hardware that's being used, the materials that are being used, the waste. We then look at social impact, of course, and diversity and inclusion. We look at those separately at Future Plus, so we can really dive into what those mean individually. So social impact perhaps might be more on things like human rights and labour rights, whereas diversity and inclusion looks at things like bias and equity. And then we also look at economic as a theme within our environment, within our sustainability framework, which often surprises people. But of course, unless something is profitable, it's not going to have a future, and we need that profitability. We are not anti-profit. You need that in order to grow the economy, or even just for the economy to function. So we look at things in those 5 pillars, and I think when you're thinking about ethics, it's kind of deep dive, understanding what those 5 pillars mean, how you can move them forward and really apply them to the use of AI. I think it's really, really important. Having that sort of that structure in place to begin with, I think, is a good starting point. Trying to get to the root of understanding.
You've referred to a lot of different elements there. So it sounds like it's really quite hard to take on all of this. And if we pick up on the environmental factor, maybe to start with, and I actually had a guest on my podcast the other day who made a really interesting point about sometimes a question is something that you should be Googling. Sometimes a question is something you want to ask AI and actually making a conscious decision of which one is it for, how much power do you want to be using for that. So there are minor things that we can all think about in our approach. But when it comes to a company and how they are going to embrace energy use, how do they really know what's going on everywhere? Because I tried to make a panorama on this years ago, and I think there's probably more information and more research around now that is available. But it was actually really difficult to dig out how much water is being used, how much power is being used. And when I spoke to people from big tech companies, they're talking about their renewable energy and the villages that they're building around it. And all of the tech companies have great answers for what they're doing. I don't know how much this is really taking place in practice now, but how can people know and trust that they're doing the right thing? Because it's one thing to have good intentions, it's another to be able to follow through.
Sure, and I feel like Matt might be a better, more well-informed person to answer this question in terms of the actual measurement piece. But I think for me there are 2 things. One is starting with addressing the amount of misinformation that there is out there. Just as a tiny micro example, my 12-year-old's best friend wouldn't speak to her for 3 days recently because she was using Gemini to help her with her homework, and her best friend had seen all these videos on TikTok about polar bears and went into an absolute meltdown and wouldn't speak to her. Now, obviously, that's just a really small example of something very, very micro, but some data I saw recently indicated that about 75% of sustainability professionals don't understand how to start measuring the GHG emissions of AI. So if people working in this space all the time are not getting to grips with that data, it's kind of mind-boggling to understand how we as everyday citizens can start to understand that data. Yeah, I feel like Matt probably has
let's hand this over to Matt. You're all about the measurements. How do we measure this?
So, I mean, you can measure in one of the most important ways to measure really is to combine tariffs, essentially, because what you really want to know when you measure the impact of AI is not just number goes up, number goes down because we plugged it into an AI system. What you really want to know is explanatory evidence. Why did it do the thing that it did? And when it comes to sustainability and emissions, you should be able to work with teams that can actually measure those kinds of outright outputs of AI to say we used AI this amount in this month and it resulted in this cost. But is it good cost? Is it why have you been using it, and is it genuinely resulting in productivity gains that will result in a benefit for your business elsewhere? It's all about trade-offs, and so you cannot decide on trade-offs if you don't know why things are doing what they're doing, which is why measurement of impact is so important, because you can essentially know where you're going to say, okay, it has this cost, whether that's emissions costs, whether that's outright costs, and you can say, okay, is this actually being spent in the right way? Are we making the right trade-offs?
And these comparisons are actually a really important part of the AI story. If you think of something like AI drug discovery, AI drug repurposing, you're able to do so much in the lab before things needing to be tested outside computationally being able to do before, without needing to actually physically test them in a lab. And so you're saving a lot of time and resource, you're saving the lights being on in the lab, you're saving so many different factors over a long period of time that it must be really hard to figure out what some of these comparisons are in not just what the cost is of using AI, but actually all of the variables that could have been involved in a previous way of doing things, if you could even do it at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and drug discovery, AI drug discovery is a really good example because you can use it in the research process and find all sorts of weird and wonderful drugs that do all sorts. And this is why sort of just looking at the sustainability side of things is one piece of the puzzle, because then you kind of expand that out to say, okay, so now we know this, and now we can measure the impacts on our costs, on our sustainability, and whatever we want to do with that, whether it's to go to investors and convince them, whether it's to convince customers that we're the right people to go to. And this is why measurement is so key to the force, which is trust. And trust is such a, it's a bit of a loaded term, because even when I hear it, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit because it very much throws up images, a bit like responsible AI in general, of everyone holding hands in a utopian society. But in reality, it's actually a very, very powerful force. And it's really due to the complexity of systems. As the complexity of a system goes up, the role of trust becomes more and more powerful in how you operate, whether that's in your internal operations, like with drug discovery and the process behind that, or whether it's to customers and how they interact with it. They want to know, whether it's employees saying, okay, I can comfortably automate this process, or I need a human in the loop, or I'm not sure whether I'm actually being over-reliant on this. All of this affects productivity, outputs, outcomes. And then on the customer side, again, trust. You want to know, I don't only want to know that it's, I feel like it's useful. I want to know, what is it doing? What effect is it having on me? How am I potentially at risk of being over-reliant? How am I actually putting at risk my productivity by essentially cognitive offloading? So, I just give my responsibility to the AI, and all of a sudden down the line, you have a reputational disaster. And that's because you don't know that all that's bubbling under the surface. And this is why it comes back to measurement. You need to measure explanatory evidence.
Well, yeah, the black box problem is a real issue when you're looking at AI augmenting humans. If it's augmenting doctors, it's helping them in a process, well, they need to know why it had the outcome that it did from the data that was input. And how do we actually get that right and make that possible? Because the way AI systems work are not going through a thought process like a human. You list, I thought this, so then that, you couldn't, and also it'll be really long. So how on earth do you actually present this to anybody?
So I guess there's two flavors of you're on about transparency essentially, and how you encourage transparency. And so there's two flavors of transparency. One is very much on the AI model side of things, which is the neural net does its magic. How does it do its magic, right? How did it reason? And that's really important. For example, medical imaging, and why did it say this patient had cancer? What about the image was the identification? And the other side of that, which is interestingly enough about 80% of the rest of the market, explaining to, again, your internal staff and your customers, where you have an AI chatbot do whatever it needs to do, explaining why is it why is it interacting? How is it interacting with your workflows? How is it interacting with your employees? How is it interacting with your customers? And what's the underlying risk of that? What is going to happen to either that customer or the business or investors trying to gauge risk, insurers trying to gauge risk? All of that is this completely different flavour of transparency that isn't just limited to this black box approach. And we can talk about the black box with frontier models all we like, and there's all sorts of debates to have about whether you can truly get to a transparent AI model, and the answer is probably not, but there are many sort of post hoc and ad hoc techniques to at least go some way towards that. But I think one of the gaps being missed is that 80% of the other market, which is everybody adopting AI, including organizations, and them explaining why is the AI chatbot doing, or whatever flavor of AI, it doesn't have to be a chatbot, any kind of AI, why is it doing what we're doing, what it's doing? And that doesn't require, complex sort of frontier model black box interrogation. That requires good evaluation building. And that's one of the biggest gaps, in my opinion, a very biased opinion, one of the biggest gaps on earth, which is evaluation. Because if you build good evaluations, and all of this begins to come to life.
A very valuable opinion. AI is, of course, so many different things that it's actually hard to answer some of these questions very broadly. But on the question of how we allow everybody to benefit equally from AI, what would your approaches be to that? And I think because AI is so many different things, it's a broad question and it's difficult. Are we talking about a job interview? Are we talking about access to legal support if they need it? There's such a spectrum of what this could be. But what are your thoughts, Zahra, and in what sort of areas?
If I look at the bigger picture, it's really, fine, companies can have all these principles. A lot of companies do that to look good. It's sort of performative, but nobody will actually, as my panelists mentioned, will really look to follow ethical principles by design or proper evaluation unless there is a cost involved, unless there's a consequence, and the consequence can only be put forth through proper regulation. It cannot come from the private sector. So you can start with, I know we've spoken about building standards. It's great, some companies might follow it, but if they're not going to make money, they will not follow standards. I've worked in the tech sector for 25 years, and this conversation comes up time and time again. No matter what you come up with, if they're not going to make profits, they don't want to do it. So then who do you hold responsible, and how and why? I think only a good regulation can do that, which requires input from not just the government, but civil society, like organizations like UKAI. Also, views of the public. I would say that when you are a victim of misuse of AI, let's say a non-consensual deepfake, or as she mentioned, what happened with a teenager, or what happened at work, for example, if you're whistleblowing on malpractices. You shouldn't be afraid because a lot of companies will, make you sign an NDA. So, or you fear, being sued for defamation or etc. So, if there's no, if you're always afraid to speak up and you're always afraid to do the right thing, then you need regulation. You can't leave it to the private sector to do that. It's not in their interest to do that, and it is not their job. Their job is to make the most money for their shareholders, for their investors, to make sure that employees are provided the salaries so they can, make a living. So their interest is completely different. So who then takes responsibility to make sure people are protected and people are not harmed?
Okay, so clearly profits are going to be taking priority in terms of a lot of decisions that are made, but also, as you alluded to earlier, trust is important. For a company to be successful, they generally need to be trusted. And so sometimes achieving that trust might come at a financial cost, which is a long-term play rather than for the short term. What are your thoughts on how that's balanced out?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. And again, to bring this back to my experience in sustainability more broadly, it's a question that is asked all the time. Can you have a sustainable business that is profitable? Can you have sustainable, ethical use of AI that also allows companies to make profits? Right? They're two very similar questions. I think I went to a fascinating talk last night by an economist called Mariana. I'm going to brutalise her beautiful Italian surname, so I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. But it was all about the good economy and what that looks like and how we can work towards that. It was a fascinating talk, and I recommend you should look at her book, which is called The Good Economy. But one of the points that she was making was around profits, and that profits are fine, but profits to excess are not fine. And I think what we're starting to see is profits to excess in a way that is, again, I use this term mind-boggling. Some of these large AI companies are being valued at $1 trillion. And is that reasonable? Is that sustainable in an economic sense? And what does that mean for everyone else? Of course, we need profits, but how do we address that in a way that is equitable? And
who is it a cost to at the same time?
Absolutely, and she made the point which I hadn't thought about before. I'm not a huge knowledgeable about the history of AI, but a lot of this data science, happened in the 1950s, the 1960s, in public institutions like NASA and defense institutions. And the tech companies are now riding on the wave, surfing the wave of that build-up of information that's happened over decades and making these enormous profits. They're also paying insane salaries to top talent, taking those people away from public institutions. So I'm not against profits at all, but I do think we need to think about this really, really carefully and work out what that looks like for society more broadly.
Well, especially if we want everybody to benefit from AI equally, because it's the much talked about, the company's worth $1 trillion, what does this mean for jobs for most graduates?
Yeah, and I would also just add, I think perhaps someone has better data on this than I do, but only one in 8 of us is using AI globally, right? We're all sitting here in London talking about this, but what about all the billions of people who are not using AI?
Yeah, of course,
they don't have a stable internet connection and they don't, have access to the tech. So.
And also the language issue. English language AI is very good. Not every language is catered for as well yet. That will take time. And so we do have differing access. How do you see equity playing out? How do we make sure that everyone benefits equally from AI and also isn't sacrificing other elements of their lives for it, for the big tech companies taking over everything and taking it all home?
I think probably one of the most important aspects is a kind of bottom-up approach. One of the things about social media and the kind of, in terms of impact on people, the disaster that it really was, is because it was big tech selling to consumers, and consumers don't actually have a lot of power. Really, they can't really influence policy in the way that massive organisations can. And so this is a bit different because yes, you have directly to consumers, but you also have to every company on earth, pretty much. And so sort of taking it from the bottom up and saying, okay, we want to use it in this way. And it really comes to an issue of incentives. And big tech frontier models have certain incentives that are driven by the market, maximize engagement and maximize profits, as with every company ever. So it's not particularly special. But companies, individual companies, adopters, have, yes, that as well. But when using AI, they are also very aware of, we don't want to cause a reputational disaster. We don't want to decrease productivity accidentally by putting it in hand-fisted. So their incentives are actually much more aligned with how AI should be used in a much more equitable way. And so sort of utilizing that kind of bottom-up power and building the infrastructure to enable that kind of angle, instead of model providers sort of saying, this is how you use it, you should be using it like this. Again, an issue with incentives, you will use it in a way that maximizes engagement. But if you come at it from the bottom up, and those opinions and the infrastructure is provided to give them a voice, as it were. I don't always like to say voice, because voice doesn't necessarily go anywhere, but the infrastructure to give it some power, then all of a sudden the incentives become much more aligned with equitable use. And so that's my 2 cents.
So who's in charge here Are the frameworks that exist already doing much good? What more do we need to do? Where are we going with getting this under control? Let's have a quick answer from each of you on all of this.
It would be a little bit controversial. Now, say 5 tech companies are in charge, and that should not be the case. In order to be truly democratic, for it to uplift people, especially in the global south, I think people have to take proactive action. You can't leave it to the 5 tech companies to make it democratic, because it's not in their interest.
Who should be in charge?
People should be in charge.
Yeah, it's so hard. I think the problem with AI is it's moving at such a pace that trying to keep ahead of it in terms of who's in charge is an impossible task, right? I mean, I agree. I think there needs to be a whole bevy of stakeholders, but the problem is with that takes time. You know, I think the UK's approach is really interesting, bringing in consortiums of different stakeholders rather than just having one government department that's in charge. But yeah, it's a wicked question, a wicked problem. I don't have the answer.
And your thoughts on an international scale, because there are no borders online. So we may try to do things differently in different countries, but how do we make this work to some extent universally?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because ultimately, you know, we're far more likely to just follow the global market forces than anything else. And so how you kind of make it work globally is, you know, your standard facts, international cooperation, things like that. And the UK is actually sort of interestingly very, very well sort of set for that. You know, we have a number of sort of very old, very powerful institutions that happen to be extremely relevant for this, like NPL, and how you, again, measure these kinds of things, but also AISI, and other institutions, sort of DSIP as well, are heavily involved. And so it's really about pushing that out into the world using the power that the UK has. Because, so say for example, between the US and the UK, there's an incredible amount of, it's really interesting because obviously the US, regulation-wise, is very much, you know, anti-regulation, as it were, maximum innovation. But in terms of developing standards, regulation and governance procedures to promote sort of democratized use and equitable use, it's actually very, very well developed. And the handy thing about that is the UK has a very special relationship with the US in terms of these standard bodies, and therefore, and because we're in a different environment, we're a much more conservative economy, much more regulated, regulation-first economy, that we're actually probably in a better environment to sort of take a lot of those sort of, whatever term you want to use, ethical practices, governance practices, and actually put them into practice in an environment that actually supports it. And then it kind of ripples out from that, because once you make it a success in the UK and it's shown to be effective and business effective, not just, again, everyone holding hands, but it's actually a demonstrable benefit to the business and makes the work more effective, then all of a sudden it ripples out because we have the power to do it.
Brilliant, thank you. That went by way too quickly. Matt, Polly and Zahra, thank you so much.